Welcome back to the Management Lab. I'm Sean Hansen from Saunders College of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology.
And I'm Uri Gal from the University of Sydney Business School. Hello, Sean.
Hey, Uri.
Hey, we have an innovation.
It has been, what?
We have an innovation here.
Yeah, the use of video. I'm not sure it's an innovation. We'll have to wait and see. Like, all I can think is, number one, now when I reference how fat I am, it'll be obvious to everyone. They'll no longer have to imagine it.
You know how sometimes when you hear somebody and you don't see their face, you're kind of starting to imagine what they look like. Do you think when they see your face, is anybody gonna be surprised by that?
That is a great question. I have no idea. Yeah, there's times that you hear like a singer and you think, well, I have an image of this person. Then you see them and you're like, what? There's no way that's the same person. Yeah, that I wonder. How about yourself? Do you think people will pick out your face with your voice?
I don't know. Well, it's hard for me to think about self-reflect in that way. I don't think that I've never heard anybody say to me, "Oh, your face looks different than your
than
voice."
What I imagine. Yeah,
than what I imagine. But then again, that never really happened. That I was in a relationship with anybody where they didn't see my face for a long period of time.
No, you weren't catfished, or you weren't catfishing somebody. I guess you would be catfished.
I don't know what that is. What is that?
Catfishing is this phenomenon where people get rooked into these fake online relationships.
Right.
And sometimes it's like not even, it's like, someone posing as a young woman and it winds up being a decrepit old man or something like that. It can be people who are very different than what they represent.
Never happened to me. To me. Hey, what do you make, I guess the biggest story of the week, or one of the biggest stories of the week, is the CEO of United Health. That's the name of the company, right? Who was murdered in New York. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So incidentally, my little joke was going to be, it's been a number of weeks since we have managed to speak with one another. And the joke was, fortunately, nothing has really happened in that time. Like in the month and a half since we've been able to record an episode, good Lord, like it's just one thing after another. As we record, we are just about 36 hours after the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, which is a regime that lasted for 54 years, if you count father and son. So it's kind of crazy times. Yeah, that murder of the healthcare exec. I think the thing, number one, a murder on public street, in New York City, right out in the open, is super disturbing, right? Like incredibly disturbing. Almost more disturbing to me is the reaction of some of the people on social media and
I know. Did you see that?
And things like that. Yeah,
justifying what happened.
Not just justifying, but celebrating. Right? I understand that people can have disagreements about the nature of the U.S. healthcare system, but people glorifying in the murder of a guy who ostensibly was just doing his job. Right? You can disagree with the way that industry operates, but that's macabre to me. A family, a man with a family, and people celebrating in his murder on the street is really a bad commentary on our contemporary moment.
They just arrested a guy, a suspect.
Oh, I didn't see that. I mean, they had him on film pretty quickly, right? This was not a secret, well kept, carried out. Well, I mean, I guess the assassination seems like it was carried out with some efficiency, but I mean, they had his images within seconds. And so I was kind of surprised that we hadn't heard that he was arrested within, 5 or 6 hours or something like that.
Yeah, well, they got him. It's it's a young guy, a 28-year-old guy who's like an anti-capitalist of some persuasion. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, the fact that allegedly the shell casings were engraved with the words, was it deny, depose? There was a third one. I forget what it is.
No, it's not depose. It's the phrase that gets used in healthcare that a lot of healthcare companies apparently default to denying claims unless evidence, unless they prod for additional evidence.
And interestingly, that company, there was a big story a couple of years ago that their AI system that they used to sort through claims had a 90% error rate.
Yeah,
Right,
it's
so
crazy.
90% of the claims that they denied were erroneously denied,
Wow.
which caused a huge outpour a couple of years ago. And I don't know if there's like a a clear cause and effect relationship here,
Well,
but
it
yeah,
certainly underscores some of the things we've talked about in the past in terms of over reliance upon algorithmic decision making and the dangers of over reliance upon algorithmic decision making.
yeah.
And
But in this
again, it underscores my point that yeah, there's plenty to critique in the industry and the conduct of the healthcare system or health financing within the United States, but that doesn't justify cold-blooded murder.
there was something else I wanted to run by you before we get into the topic that we actually wanted to talk about today, which is creativity. But before we get into that, I wanted to get your take on something that happened here in Australia. So I don't know if you've heard about this, but the Parliament here passed a bill a week and a half ago or so to ban under 16-year-olds from social media. That's going to come into effect next year. What's your
Interesting.
what's your initial reaction to this?
Yeah, so you're getting me total first blush. Although I want to say that when this was initially being proposed, you had some writings online in this regard that I recall seeing.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think I'd have to ponder it. I have to be honest, my initial reaction is kind of favorable because I've sort of put my cards on the table before that I think social media has in many ways been a net ill for society. And I'm not a Luddite, I'm not a person who generally is opposed to technology, but I think the evidence of the real damage that it has done to the psyche of an entire generation is pretty clear. Jonathan Haidt, who's somebody that we've referenced in the past in some of our conversations, I think has made a pretty good argument that a lot of the mental issues we've seen a dramatic rise in the mental issues and mental health concerns of young adults, certainly in American society. I think in most Western societies. Actually, I don't know that most Western societies, but certainly in
Uh,
the U.S. society.
there's data from multiple countries in the West that
Interesting.
shows very similar trends.
Yeah, that it's been, and as I recall, Height ties it very specifically back to the introduction of the like button on Facebook, and it
Yeah,
was
I don't
like
think he's the
this.
only one to have done that, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
I
guess
mean,
my initial inclination is maybe this is something that's very warranted and worth consideration. Now, I will say, when my 18-year-old, if she ever listens to our podcast and hears me say that, will freak out. uh, she likes her social meds.
well, by 18, she's fine. She's golden.
Yeah, right.
I mean, to me, one of the most telling things about this conversation was the arguments that were made against it, which I thought were quite feeble for the most part. So the main argument that I actually thought had some substance to it is that you have all these marginalized groups that find each other online through
Mm-hmm.
whatever their platform of choice, and otherwise they would be isolated and alienated. So that I understand. So I think that's something that needs to be considered, and we need to figure out a way to allow these people to connect to one another. But the arguments from big tech companies around freedom of expression and
Mm-hmm.
freedom of speech for teenagers, I mean, give me a break. No one's saying
Yeah.
these guys cannot talk. They can talk and discuss and use whatever messaging app that they want. No one's forbidding them from expressing their I'm sure fully fleshed out, sophisticated, interesting views that they have about matters of the day. It just, I don't know, it strikes me as a bit of a stretch to make this
I'm
argument.
a little I would say I'm a little sensitive or responsive. Like I can hear that argument. Like I get the point. This is why I would almost have to reflect on this a little more before giving an official reaction, because you're not saying they can't speak, but you are blocking them from a prominent mode of communication, a prominent contemporary mode of communication, and so I can see some of
Yeah.
that argument for sure. I mean, we do block uh, pre-adolescents from all kinds of things. We also don't let 12-year-olds drive, right? I don't know, maybe in Australia you do, but
No, I think you have to be a bit older than that.
we don't let people under the age of 16 engage in all kinds of behavior
They can't
within our
drink, they
society.
can't smoke, they can't gamble, they can't vote, right? I mean, speaking about
Yeah.
free speech.
They can drink beer in Germany.
Yeah, I think it's pretty
Yeah.
lax here as well. But be that as it may, yeah. So I mean, you're right. I think my perspective is that it's a net positive. But I do think that the approach here has been somewhat narrow. Because if you take out this massive outlet that people have right now, you have to come up with something else, like with offline programs or school programs to allow people to hang out and communicate with one another through other means that they haven't been used to before. There
Yeah.
needs to be some kind
That
of
that
support system that I haven't seen the government talk about here at all, which is I think that's a deficit in the way they're thinking about it.
Sure. The community building piece is, of course, a lot of the original sort of idealized or utopian vision of the internet, right? That the internet
Yeah,
in and of itself would become this place where people can find community, can find others who are like-minded, and maybe if they grow up in a sort of cloistered context, they don't have those opportunities to interact with other people who are like-minded in ways that are different than their surroundings. So I think that was always sort of a lot of the articulated vision of the online world in general.
yeah,
I do think we're seeing some of the downsides of enabling people to communicate with people who are like-minded, in that they only communicate with people who are like-minded, right? Like we have this move away from uh, a broad informational diet, right? Where people basically gravitate to spaces where they're just going to hear others reinforcing their preconceived notions. And I think we've talked about this in various ways, but I think it's led to a very sort of tribal and
yeah.
divided society.
I mean, I've found that I had to make explicit effort to look for informational sources that don't immediately correlate with my preconceived notions about politics or economics or whatever. So you actually have to be explicit about this.
Yeah, or don't necessarily align with any preconceived notions, right? Like, where can you go to get sort of a neutral representation of the news? I think I've talked about this with you, where I'll often go to the BBC website, and it's crazy to me that living in the United States in 2024, I would have to look to the BBC's website for news. But most of
Why is
the
that? Why is that
news,
crazy to you?
I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of news sources in the United States. Why would I have to look at a news source outside the United States to find what seems like a fairly even-handed representation of what happened today or yesterday or last week, right?
Yeah, it's funny describing the BBC as even-handed. I think many people would disagree. But anyway, that's a
Yeah,
topic for a different conversation.
right. I think you're right. I think that's true. I find it more even-handed than most of the major news outlets in the United States. My concern is that most of the major news outlets in the United States have sort of abandoned journalistic ethics in many ways and just have ceded to their loudest the ceded ground to the loudest members of their audience and tell them what they want to hear.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how do we move from this to creativity, which is what we
Let's
wanted
be
to talk about?
creative.
Let's be. I think that's a demonstration of our lack of creativity right
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah.
Whose choice was it to talk about creativity?
Who's the good segue?
I
This
think
was
it,
yours.
I think it was
This was
mine.
yours. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, just right off the bat: do you consider yourself a creative person?
Um. Yeah. Yeah. I think I would consider myself
Really?
a creative person. Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
want to reconsider your answer?
No, I think, I think in my own self conception, yeah, I think I'm fairly creative. I mean, I'm not an artist, but I used to write when I was younger. I used to write
What?
things. Yeah.
What?
I'm not talking about writing like journal articles and things like that. I used to
How long?
enjoy
How long have we known
art.
each
I
other?
used,
We've known each other what 20 years?
yeah, 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 probably 22. No,
I've
about 20. Yeah, yeah. It would have been
I've never
2004,
heard
I
I've
think.
never heard that before.
Yeah.
So what did you use to
Yeah.
write?
Oh, just, like I didn't publish anything, but I would write short stories. I used to like art. I used to write poetry. I used to
Wow.
write poetry to Susie, to my wife when we were like
Are you
dating. She liked
serious?
it. She liked it. Yeah. I also
Wow.
used to read other people's poetry to her. So
That's the Irish part of you,
yeah,
I would
yeah,
venture, I guess. The romantic Irish.
yeah.
Wow, okay.
I don't know that romantic is a word that people often associate with the Irish, but the Mediterranean folks tend to get that a lot more often. But
Okay, well that's a different kind of romance, I guess.
lots of good
Okay,
writers, certainly.
so you're a creative person. I would not say the same thing about me. I'm hopelessly uncreative, I think. I don't know why. So I was I play the
Yeah,
guitar. You can see a bit of the amp behind me in the background, and the tip of my wah pedal. So I play the guitar, but for the life of me, I cannot compose music, and I've tried many times. And I would even listen with my kids to they have all these little teenage singers that they like. I think
yep,
I've sent you a link a few months ago to one of them, and they write their own
you
music.
did.
There's these teenagers, which is not very good, and I kept saying to myself, if they can do it, like I should definitely be able to write something, and I've I just can't. And I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm being lazy or just utterly uncreative. Maybe it's a bit of both because I don't spend too much time and too much effort trying to do that. But then again, if you're creative, it shouldn't be that difficult to do, right?
So I don't know. I think it is. I think it is difficult. I think there's a reason that the term writer's block exists, right? And those are people who write professionally, right? Like people who are doing this, even skilled artists can have moments of sort of uh, creative challenge. I do think that creativity, and we'll get into this in some of the research, I think, but creativity is the kind of thing that has to be exercised and nurtured. It's like any other skill, right? If you don't engage in it and exercise it, then it doesn't progress, and indeed it degrades, right? I'm trying to think of who it was. It was a famous violinist. Might have been it's Yitzhak Perlman. Is that a violinist?
He
You can
was,
check it
I
while I'm
believe, yeah.
talking. And I think he was quoted as saying, if I don't practice for a day, nobody can tell. If I don't practice for a week, myself and a number of the people in the audience would be able to tell. If I don't practice for a month, everyone in the room would be able to tell, right? And that was a guy who was a virtuoso, right? And so this idea is, with creativity, it has to be nurtured and it has to be exercised. And if you don't do it, then it's not going to develop.
Yeah. Okay, so but we're talking about creativity in the workplace, right? In
Workplace
organization.
creativity, yeah.
Well, both workplace creativity at the organizational level, because there's differences between organizations in terms of how much creativity they're able to bring to bear to create new products and services. Like if there's been this, I don't know if it's still ongoing in the US because I'm talking about maybe 10 years ago that they had these ads. I think they were Apple ads, and they were comparing themselves to Microsoft. So Apple was the cool kid, and micro, and maybe I'm butchering
PC.
the ad. What PC?
PC is what the other guy was. It was Apple and PC, where Apple was like,
All
God,
right.
now you put me on the spot. Justin Long, I think, was the actor, Justin Long. So he was like a young kid, right? And then I forget the guy. He was formerly on the Daily Show, but he was PC, so he was sort of like the stuffy
This dull, boring.
older guy. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So yes, you have you can, as an organization, you could be more or less creative, more or less innovative, but also there's obvious individual differences between people in terms of how creative they are. So
I
well, I
think we
guess
should
we'll,
draw.
yeah, go on.
I think we should draw a quick distinction there, because one of the things I was really interested in looking at some of this research is that there's a very clear uh, demarcation between creativity and innovation, right? I think particularly when we're talking about organizational dynamics, we often sort of associate creativity and innovation together. In the research literature, they define them very distinctly. Um, and so it might be worthwhile just to underscore that. Can I give you one from one of these papers? So they describe, this is actually Lee et al. In the European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, but they're citing somebody else. So I'll cite the original one, which is Hughes et al. 2018, where they say workplace creativity concerns the cognitive and behavioral processes applied when attempting to generate novel ideas. So the creation of novel ideas is the creativity piece, whereas workplace innovation concerns the processes applied when attempting to implement new ideas. So creativity is the idea generation. It doesn't get called innovation until you can basically commercialize. Maybe commercialize isn't the right term. I don't want someone coming at me like like a healthcare exec or something. But until someone can translate those novel ideas into products and services and bring it to the
Like
marketplace, then
to
it's
make it more
not innovation.
tangible. Yeah. Right. So creativity is like the cognitive mental activity that happens to generate new ideas, and innovation is the application of these ideas in real life in products and services. So before we started, you had a good idea as to how to structure the conversation, because we can go about this from different angles. So do you want to guide the way real quick, just to signpost what we're going to do?
Yeah, so it seems to me that there's several different facets. I should say, by the way, this is literature that I was totally unfamiliar with. I mean, I'm sure I've encountered it at some point or another, but I had not seen any of this research before. So in sort of reading through a number of studies that we did, the things that jumped out at me is that there's a number of different, very distinct facets to it. One is the personality piece that focuses on sort of individual creativity. What are the personality characteristics that tend to result in creativity or signal creativity? There's a separate question around, or two maybe, around the work environments. One is leadership, models or approaches to leadership that tend to foster creativity within a environment. So then there's this other facet on the organizational side, which is the environment, right? Sort of characteristics of the environment that promote or inhibit creativity outside of the role of the leader. I guess there's a fourth, and or there's maybe fourth and fifth, which is the distinction between individual and group creativity, and the degree to which creativity can be demonstrated not just by individuals within an organization, but also by groups. And then the last piece, which is one that is sort of consistent with some of the other things we've talked about, is the impact of artificial intelligence on creativity. And obviously that's newer research, but it's pretty interesting what they're finding there.
Yeah, generative AI specifically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you want to? Where are we starting? What do we want to talk about first?
So I mean, we can just talk about the individual piece first.
Okay.
I guess this was the least surprising to me, because it seems like a lot of this seems to pull in ideas of the Big Five personality index. Not surprisingly, the characteristics that seem to be most closely related to creativity were openness to experience.
Oh yeah. So the Big Five doesn't have creativity as such as one of the dimensions,
Right.
right? But it does have
Right.
openness. Openness to what? How is it defined in the Big Five?
A lot of times it's just labeled as openness, but I think it's most often characterized as openness to experience.
Right.
So this is sort of the personality characteristic of how open are you to trying new things, to doing things that you've not done before. So not surprisingly, that openness to experience seems to be pretty highly correlated with individual creativity.
Yeah.
I believe the other one, extrovert. Actually, I need to go check the sources.
I have a few more. So there's a paper from Oldham and Cummings in actually 1996, but it's very highly cited. It was published in AMJ, Academy of Management Journal. They talk about three different things. They talk about having broad interests as a strong indicator of individual level creativity, attraction to complexity, which I thought was quite interesting. I'm not entirely sure how you measure this, but I guess there's a way to do it. And high risk or ambiguity tolerance. So high tolerance for risk taking and for tolerance.
Or for ambiguity. You said high tolerance for tolerance, right. High tolerance for ambiguity. Yeah.
Risk and ambiguity. Yeah. Yeah. Which all makes sense, right?
Yep. I think, and now when you list those, I definitely think I lean toward creativity. I do. Like, I think I'm pretty okay with ambiguity. I sort of accept ambiguity in life and recognize that there's not always a right answer to every question. And anyway, it's an interesting little typology.
Yeah, I'm self-reflecting for a minute. I mean, I think there's a difference. I mean, just because two things are correlated, they're not the same, right? And that there's not necessarily a strong cause relationship either. I think there's a difference. I mean, I always say to people and to myself, maybe especially to myself, that one of the hallmarks of being an adult is the ability to cope with ambiguous situations and accept different positions on a given topic, right? Not everything is clear cut and not everything goes your way. So you have to accept tolerance. You have tolerance again. I'm mixing up words. You have to accept ambiguity, and that there is not always a clear answer to, why are we on this earth and why we are alive, and many other things.
Yeah.
But that does
I'm
not make me
I'm
creative.
certain that that's a quote. Hold on. There's somebody who said something like Hallmark. We can cut out me searching this, but
No,
Hallmark
that's
of
that. So far, that's the best part of the conversation. You're really highlighting and I said it before, but I'll say it again because it was so spot on. I think the Soviet color palette of your video chain. It's like
Yeah.
brown with gray mixed with a bit of military green.
Yeah. Before we got on, Uri said that. Well, I am wearing sort of a
Well, are you just breaking the
military green.
fourth wall?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. But Uri accused me of looking like a scene out of The Americans or Chernobyl. Yeah. I'll see if I can get a more creative background for future recordings.
What are you looking up?
So it was it was F. Scott Fitzgerald. I guess the exact quote is, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function."
Mm-hmm. There you go.
You know who F. Scott Fitzgerald was?
What if I said no? How would that make you feel?
Well, sometimes you like to disparage Americans, so I don't know if you read American authors.
Why don't you explain to everybody who it was? I know you're just dying for an opportunity to put your
No. I
promote on
guarantee
this
the
plate.
vast majority of American listeners had to read The Great Gatsby at some time in their lives. Just a 20th century American author.
Do you actually have to read it for school?
Oh
The
yeah,
Great
it's one of
Gatsby?
those. Oh yeah,
All right.
it's one of those that's sort of de rigueur.
All right, we digressing. So these
Yeah,
were,
yeah.
I guess, some of the primary individual antecedents for creativity, right? So broad interest, attraction to complexity, high tolerance for risk and ambiguity. And what was the one that you mentioned before?
Openness to experience was the
Openness to
first one.
experience, one of the big five.
Now,
I
I
guess
think all of those are things that can be nurtured, by the way. So one of the big questions is if creativity were just a personality characteristic. And a lot of the big five are sort of stable over time, so that people tend to have just, lock in on certain levels across time. But to my mind, those are all things that can be nurtured in a business professional, a young adult, anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could. I have two young kids, and you had young kids as well. You can definitely train your kids or educate your kids or talk to them about the importance of looking at things from different perspectives and, tackle issues in a more refined, multifaceted way. I don't use that language with my kids, but you know what I'm saying. Rather than
Yeah,
having
but that's, I
different
mean,
appreciations brought to them.
So I think that's very true with kids who are very sort of intellectually malleable. But, from a management perspective, I think even with, adult working professionals, you can nurture their sort of comfort with ambiguity and their introduction to different perspectives.
In fact, there's a whole industry of consulting firms that do that claim to do exactly that, right? To increase people's creativity in the workplace.
Yeah.
All right. So that was the first dimension. What's the next one we want to tackle?
Well, the second question is sort of group. Well, this wasn't the second one that I posed a second ago, but let's go ahead and do it now. Individual versus group creativity.
Okay.
Right. So I think we often think of creativity just as an individual thing, right? An individual characteristic. But I think there's pretty good evidence that groups can also be more or less creative. And sometimes it's the presence or absence of creative individuals within them that can have a multiplicative effect on their coworkers. And
okay, so what are some of the things that we know about how to put together groups to enhance their creativity? Let's see. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So I'm looking at a study from, God, I hope I'm pronouncing the names right. It's Zhu and Hover. research on workplace creativity. It was published in 2014 in the Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior. And they point out a couple of different things that have to do with the attributes of groups and their relationship with creativity. So groups with high cohesiveness or shared goals tend to be more creative, which I actually thought was a bit surprising, because typically when you have this strong homogeneity in objectives, that I would have thought that actually reduces creativity, but they found that it increases creativity.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that as well.
Right? We
I think
talked
it's
about.
Zhao, by the way.
Oh,
Zhao and Hover. But
I
anyway, doesn't
apologize.
matter. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
apologize.
Yeah.
Participative decision making. So to include more people in the process of making decisions about certain things, which I guess does make sense
Mm-hmm.
intuitively to me anyway. Having a supportive climate, right, where you don't shoot down people for asking weird questions, or to say things that you're not supposed to say, to create a safe space for people to express themselves and ideas that might be perceived, at least initially, as out of the field or out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Groups that have members with a long tenure tend to be more creative, which
Yeah,
again I thought was.
that was another one that I found surprising.
So yeah, I guess there's a couple of different ways of thinking about this. One is,
Yeah.
the longer people are there, the more they know each other, the less there is to discover about how different people think, and the less innovative configurations of ideas that are there to explore, right? But I guess the other angle is that the longer people work together, the higher the level of trust is, interpersonal trust
Mm-hmm.
is, which I
Mm-hmm.
think might be an important aspect of creativity, because you do need to feel secure and safe in saying things that might be perceived as, like we said before, as weird or unconventional, without fearing repercussions from peers and managers
Or judgment. Yeah.
or judgment. Yeah,
Yeah. Actually, I'm guessing that that's the mechanism ultimately, right?
probably.
So if we find that greater tenure, and like you, I was surprised by that finding, but I imagine the mechanism is that sort of development of trust and people feeling comfortable trying new things, expressing new ideas,
Mm.
floating novel ideas to the group.
Yeah. Another thing that they came up with is groups with members high in need for closure are less creative. So I guess
Yeah.
it's more of an individual thing, but than a group thing. But when you have multiple individuals in a group that have high need for closure, that decreases creativity, and that immediately made me think of Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, because he famously had a very high need for closure.
I
Do
think
you
we should
remember that
start bringing in clips. Now, if we're going to do video, we should start bringing in clips.
from other
But
shows?
yeah, from just shows. No, I don't know what you're talking about in particular, specifically though.
Well,
So
there's a
that's
whole
good to
episode
hear.
where Amy is just torturing him by, playing the start of the American anthem, but doesn't let him finish, and a bunch of things like that, because he has this very strong need for closure, and she's just trying to mess with him. Anyway.
Nice. Yeah, dispositional need for closure I thought was interesting. Now that one wasn't surprising to me though, right? The groups that need closure to any given I don't know, project or task. Um, that seemed to be sort of the opposite of comfort with ambiguity, right?
Hmm.
Um, people who need an answer, a very distinct answer, that's sort of the need for closure. Well, if you have a strong need for an answer to any question and can't sit with the idea that maybe an answer will be forthcoming at some later date, that suggests that you're not so comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I don't know if you remember when we were PhD students, one of our professors, a couple of them actually, were involved in writing a book about design. It
Mm-hmm.
was Dick Boland and I think Fred Colopy was
It
on
was
that book
Fred.
as
Yeah.
well.
Yep.
And they had this idea. So they were looking at Frank Gehry, who's I guess, I don't know if he's still around actually, but he's a famous
The
architect
firm
who's,
certainly is. Yeah.
yeah. And they're famous for creating these wacky looking buildings that could sort of look like, I don't know, crumpled paper, or spaceships, depending on your perspective, I guess. They don't have very many straight angles in these buildings. They look very, very wonky. Yeah, so they were
So
talking about their,
the Disney Music Hall in LA, if people have seen that, and certainly the Peter B. Lewis building where we were studying at the time.
yeah, in Cleveland. Not sure how many people know
Yeah,
about that building though.
yeah. You never know. Yeah,
There's the Guggenheim Museum in
in
Spain, I think.
Bilbao. Yeah, in
Bilbao,
Bilbao,
yeah,
Spain. Right.
there's a bunch of them. They're kind of
It's once
unmistakable.
you see these buildings, you know
Yeah.
it's a Gary design. Yeah,
There's a, I don't know if no, actually it is a building. I think they're big sculptures in one of Chicago's parks. I forget which one it is. Anyway, there's a bunch of them all over the place. And so yeah, they wrote
and
a.
Frank Gehry is still alive. He is
Is it?
95 years old. Yeah.
Wow, good for him. So they had this idea of liquid crystal or something along these lines that they came up with to kind of represent their the way they're thinking about design. So they're thinking about solid structures, of course, but they're thinking about them in very flexible ways, very late into the design and process and construction processes, right? So they keep things fluid for very long before they actually put them into actual physical structures.
Yeah.
So very,
Yeah,
very low
that was a
need for
really good
closure
book.
there. Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, Managing as Design, I think, was the title of that one.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
So, but there are other things that have to do with, I guess, what did you call them before? Environmental. That have to do with the organization,
Yeah, I
rather
think you
than.
already hit on one of these, which is that supportive environment, an environment that's sort of context, right? Just sort of the culture or the context of the workspace,
Mhm.
and that idea of a supportive environment where people feel like uh, they're they're going to be supported by their colleagues, by the organization,
Yeah.
things like that tends to foster more creative mindsets.
Yeah, there was another interesting study from Montani rather, and others in 2020 that looked at the relationship between innovation and workload,
Mm-hmm.
and they found, interestingly, an inverted U-shaped relationship between workload and innovative behavior. So if workload is really low, you don't tend to be very innovative. If it's moderate, you tend to be quite innovative. And if it's too high, if it's very high workload, then innovation drops again. And
Yeah.
interestingly, it was mediated by work engagement, right? So
Yeah.
workload leads to work engagement, which in turn leads to innovation. So if you have very low
Yeah.
workload, you don't tend to be very engaged, and the innovation is low. And at moderate levels, engagement is very high, and then it drops again, and innovation drops as well.
Yeah.
Did you find
And
this surprising at all?
I didn't find it surprising. I do think it's a good insight, though, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, to me, it's fairly there's an intuitive appeal to it, right? So, if you have a very low workload, you're like looking for things to do, right? These stereotypical stories about people like surfing the internet or
Looking for their next job.
fu- yeah, filling time. If they don't have much work, you can imagine why that would lead to sort of a low level of creativity. They're just their minds aren't engaged in their work. At the same time, you could see the opposite side of that inverted U. If they're just inundated, if they're just the workload so high and they're feeling overwhelmed, it makes a lot of sense why that would not be conducive to creativity. I
You're
guess
right,
the
but then
challenge is finding the sweet spot in the middle.
yeah, but there was another finding from Zhao and Hoover's paper that at least challenges this finding, or maybe even entirely contradicts it. I'm not entirely sure. So they looked at chronic time pressure, which I think would be highly correlated with workload. I would think, maybe it isn't entirely, but I would think there would be a high correlation there. And they found that chronic time pressure has actually a direct positive effect on creativity. So
Interesting.
granted,
I
they're talking
don't
about
know that I caught that one.
so they're talking about creativity rather than innovation. Maybe that's why
Hmm.
there's a different relationship there. But yeah, they talk about chronic time pressure as being directly and positively related to creativity, and they're also talking about individuals rather than the entire workplace. So maybe
So
there's.
I can posit an explanation there.
Mhm.
So in something like agile software development, where you work in short cycles, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. a big argument for that approach to software development, and it's now been adopted in all kinds of domains of project management, is that it creates a more manageable workload, that you don't have these periods of intense demand and other periods of lulls, but it creates this sort of manageable, consistent rhythm of work.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means that you have, I don't know if intense is the right word, but you have clear, consistent time pressures. You have to deliver things in those environments. Sometimes your work has to be checked in every day, so it's like I got to be done by the end of the day with this particular task. But certainly your cycles, again, let's say a 2-week sprint cycle, that's the iteration in a Scrum, one particular agile methodology environment is called a sprint. If your sprint cycles are every 2 weeks, that's a pretty clear time pressure, right? You're supposed to get these things done in those 2 weeks, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you become overloaded with work, or at least the premise is that it's a much more manageable workload.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is. That makes sense as well. And then I think the second to last piece is leadership. And because there's a lot of research that looks at the relationship between different forms and styles of leadership and their impact on innovation and creativity. And of course, that's the most immediate, that piece has the most immediate implications for managers, although the other ones do as well, but we can talk about this later. So one thing that I thought was really interesting and pertinent was managers' expectations of their employees. So you familiar with I'm going to put you on the spot now here, the Pygmalion effect?
I don't think I am.
Oh, Sean.
I'm familiar with Pygmalion.
Oh, Pygmalion. Okay, so I'm sorry I mispronounced it.
No, I wasn't.
Don't be passive
No,
aggressive with me.
I wasn't calling. I wasn't calling you out. I don't think I'm familiar with the Pygmalion effect. If you see if you can jog my memory.
So it's basically the idea that people behave based on the expectations of other people of them, right? So if you expect somebody to perform badly, they're more likely to perform badly. But if you expect them to perform really well, then they're more likely to perform really well. So if managers expect people to behave in creative ways, they're more likely to be creative in the workplace. So that's what that study found. That same study from Zhao and Hover, which, by the way, was a review of other studies. That's why they have so many different findings in that paper. So,
yeah,
did you say Pygmalion or Pygmalion?
Pygmalion.
Pygmalion, which I don't know. It sounds like a pretty American pronunciation of that name to me.
Call it the My Fair Lady effect.
All right. What else did we see about the relationship between leadership style and creativity?
So one of the things that was pretty wild to me is how many different styles of leadership have been documented in the research literature. Because in one of these studies, and I believe this was the Lee et al. European Journal Work in Organizational Psychology, one of the ones I think I referenced before, they looked at just a huge set of different leadership styles involving like ethical dimensions, so like authentic leaders or moral dimension. So authentic servant leadership, ethical leadership, humble leadership, empowering versus entrepreneurial, supportive and benevolent, destructive and authoritarian. So they have all these different dimensions, and as a result, you get a lot of nuance in terms of the types of leadership that make a difference for creative behavior. I think the big takeaways there are transformational. That's another one, right? So that the leadership approaches that seem to be most beneficial for creativity are the transformational, which is sort of focused on getting people on board with a vision, not as focused on micromanagement or task, authenticity in leadership. Those elements seem to foster creativity, and again, not terribly surprising, but sort of a domineering or authoritarian style of leadership is just a killer.
Yeah.
for creativity in groups.
Yeah. So there was another study that basically confirms what you just said. So they found, that's Oldham and Cummins from 1996, which we referenced before, that where is it? Employees who were supervised in a supportive, non-controlling fashion were more likely to exhibit creative behavior, right? So it's basically the same thing as you said, just from different study. Right? Give
Yeah.
people the freedom to experiment, don't judge them, and don't overly control what they're doing, and they're more likely to exhibit creative behaviors. Which, again, is not surprising. What is surprising is how many leaders don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And you and I had a conversation the other day about another scenario, a real life scenario, which will not um, recapture here. But you know, senior leaders that you would expect to, well, both to know the literature and to have the right intuition about these things, who lead organizations that are clearly knowledge-based organizations that they're not based on manual repetitive labor. They're actually, their success is heavily predicated on the creativity of their workforce,
Yeah.
and yet
Generation of
they,
novel ideas again.
yeah, and yet
Yeah.
they do all the wrong things. Smart, highly educated people, experienced people who do consistently all the wrong things. Which that's amazing to me that it happens, but
So
it happens
why do you
so
think that
often.
is? Why do you think that is when you sort of look at it and read it?
I think there's probably different reasons in different situations, and so I'm gonna abstract of the previous example to kind of speculate about why, in different circumstances, people might exhibit these tendencies for control. I think many people who rise to the top of these organizations are probably highly driven individuals, and I think at least some highly driven individuals um, tend to want to have it their way, and tend to be very competitive and very individualistic in nature. So that's probably some of it. I think in some cases people are, they buy into a certain institutional order where managers have this power because they've always had it, or maybe they see other leaders in similar positions in similar organizations with this power, and they want to have a similar influence within their own organization. So these mimetic tendencies, if we want to
Mm-hmm.
take the institutional route to this answer. So I think there might be different reasons, but the prevalence of these views and these predispositions is hard to ignore. Well,
Mimetic meaning imitation, by the way.
yes,
I'm just
sorry.
assuming not everyone uses the same theoretical
Right.
nomenclature that you or I would
What's
use.
your intuition on this?
It's very similar to your initial one, which is the people are very driven, but also a lot of people who rise to those positions of leadership have been very successful in doing that, right? Like by definition,
Yeah.
they've had great success, and I think that can often foster a bit of a God complex, or like a perception that they know the right answer to every problem, right?
Mhm.
And so if they get that perception that, look, I know the answer here, you just listen, um, I think that leads to that sort of very directive approach to management. Look, I know the answer, just listen and do what I say.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's a somewhat of a double-edged sword there, because I think many senior leaders, and probably rightfully, have this enhanced sense of self-confidence because they have been, like you said, by definition, they've been successful. And
Mm-hmm.
I forget the name of this bias, but you probably know what it is. You just shout out the name, when we tend to associate successes with our own abilities, but failures with environmental factors.
Oh yeah. The Could it be the fundamental attribution error?
I think that's what that is. Yes, I think you're right. So there's probably some of that at play there as well.
Other people's failures we associate with them,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
our
but
own
your own failure,
failures we
that's
attribute to the environment.
that's the
Yes.
environment. Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
um,
So I think that's good. There's one thing I want to touch on here that gets to both this leadership and the context, and I think it's something we've talked about a little bit before. Um, is this tolerance for failure piece? right?
Mhm.
That that is a cultural dynamic within an organization, and it is definitely something that again leaders can foster. But if you have an environment where there is a very low tolerance for failure, you have to get things right every time. Any new idea, if it's a failure, you're going to be shamed in some way or ridiculed for getting it wrong, is going to be a creativity killer, right? You
Yeah.
this idea that you can try something new, and if it doesn't work, that's okay. Don't keep doubling down on a failed idea, but if you fail, move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I think is really critical for fostering creativity in
Yeah.
organizational life.
Yeah, places where failures are in fact a form of success, right? Because you cannot
Mm-hmm.
succeed without having failed before. It's very rare that that happens. And there's, many people say in the fighting business as well that there's more to learn from failures and from losses than from wins and successes.
In what business? The fighting business?
The fighting business, yeah.
Do you
And
have a
I
little?
was
Do
I
you have
was
a little
reading about it. I was
side
reading about
gig
the
you
UFC
want to
before we
tell me about?
started. No, I was going to say something else. What was I going to say? Yeah.
Oh,
So
let me. While you're thinking about it, let me throw this out. One of the other leadership styles that showed up as sort of in conducive to creativity was an entrepreneurial leadership style. I
mhm.
think that goes back to that tolerance for failure. No great entrepreneur that I've ever known is not someone who didn't have a tolerance for failure. There's a reason we have this phrase serial entrepreneurs. They're people
Mm,
who try something out. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. If it
yeah.
doesn't, move on to the next thing. If it does, that's great. But even there, they know when to get out, right? And have an exit strategy. And so I think that entrepreneurial leadership brings in a big part of that tolerance for failure
Yeah, and
ethos.
also I think that paper mentioned that relationship at least is partly explained by the fact that entrepreneurs tend to be creative people themselves, so they
Mm-hmm.
understand
Mm-hmm.
what it takes to cultivate it and to encourage others to be creative as well. So that there's some of that as well. All right,
That's
let's should
something
we
we
talk
should
about
come back to. I think we
what
should
is?
come just as a note. I think this should be a future episode because there's a whole research on entrepreneurship, and I have in my life often wondered, can you really foster good entrepreneurship,
Yeah,
or is it something that's just built in to a personality or a style? But
noted.
that's for a separate episode. Yeah.
Okay, so the last piece is the technology, right? And specifically
Okay.
the AI element and the way it relates to creativity. So we looked at two studies. Let's be clear about the studies that we looked at to make sure we're doing them justice. So one was from Doshi and Hauser, 2024. Gen AI enhances individual creativity but reduces the collective diversity of novel content.
Mm-hmm.
That's the title of the paper. I think it's probably the most descriptive title I've ever seen for a paper before.
Yeah, it sort of
And
tells the
as the
whole
name
story.
suggests, so they looked at the use of chatbots for writing tasks to write content. And what they found was that the usage of AI, of generative AI, increased creativity at the individual level, but that the divergence across texts between individuals was actually lowered. So it produced less innovation or creativity collectively.
Yeah, yeah, which is interesting and a little depressing to me.
Say
Um,
more.
well, I think as we use more and more AI in our lives, I mean, I'm certainly seeing it more in higher education, right? Like plenty of people are. It becomes quite clear that students are using AI in various ways, and the idea that it can enhance their individual creativity, but it gets this sort of beige soup, right? Where it's all the
Much
same,
like your
right?
background, yes.
Where it's all sort of the same, I think, is a real concern. This is one of the things that has occurred to me a lot lately with regard to the use of generative AI is the idea that it's sort of a wisdom of the crowds effect, right? Um, the wisdom of the crowds is this idea that collectives can often be much more accurate at predicting things than individuals. if you have one of those old contests where it's like there's a gumball machine and you say how many gumballs or jelly beans or whatever are in the jar, each individual guess is very frequently far from the mean. But
Mhm.
if you take the average, the mean for the group, that tends to be pretty darn close to the
Mhm.
actual number of jelly beans in the jar, right?
Yeah.
And this is referred to as wisdom of the crowds. It goes back to, I think, Francis Galton, a little social exercise on weighing guessing the weight of a heifer or something like that. Um, and I feel like that's what sort of generative AI is. It's sort of the wisdom of the crowds. It can tell you the collective intuition that can be gleaned from online content, right? But you're not going to get super innovative things from it, right? I mean, maybe you can if you know how to do prompt engineering just right, but in general,
Yeah.
you're not going to get like what an artist does, a good artist, which is create something fundamentally new and innovative.
Yeah. So my experience has been the same as what you're describing. That you can pretty easily prompt the bot to write pretty good text, be it
Mm-hmm.
academic or a story or an email or a message or whatever. It can do it in a fairly proficient way, at least from a lingual grammatical perspective. But to be innovative or to like I've never been wowed by a text that was generated by AI in terms of its artistic qualities or to look at things from a novel perspective. That hasn't really happened. I mean, it's pretty good at. I mean, so I would use AI when I think about an idea for a paper, for instance, and I would ask it, how would you examine this idea from the perspective of this theory or that theory? So to the extent that the AI knows the theory, and of course it knows the theory because it knows everything that's on the internet and beyond,
Yeah.
it will do a pretty good job at spelling out how that theory would examine that idea. But I could have done that had I had the time to read the theory, or if I wasn't too lazy to do it myself. But
At least you're honest. Yeah.
there is a certain blandness to the texts that it generates. Now you will find people that are kind of I don't know, self-described AI gurus or futurists or whatever, and they would argue that you just need to know how to prompt the bot and to ask it
Yeah.
the right questions or the right follow-up questions, and that's kind of the to take it to the next step. I don't know. I
I'm not sure
haven't
they're right.
I haven't experienced that myself.
Well, and I've also seen some research recently suggesting that there is a sort of um, movement to the mean in terms of creativity in content, right? You can get Dolly or Midjourney or one of these image generators to generate images that are really cool, but you start to see that that there's very little variation between them. The results wind up being very similar, and so I think there is a bit of a blending together of ideas, and it's going to be harder and harder to get truly creative or novel concepts
Yeah.
out of this content. I do think one of the things that worries me, just as at a societal level, is there's all this talk about using AI for writing movie scripts or sitcom scripts or things like this. I think we as a culture have a real challenge with a lack of creativity right now. In the last year, I heard something, or the last 6 months or something like that, the top 10 movies at the box office have all been sequels for the first time ever. Top
Right.
10 movies have all been sequels or prequels or, something derivative.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just anecdotal, but it's a bad indicator for the level of creativity in our society.
So, do you watch much Netflix or another streaming service?
Yeah.
I think there's a similar phenomenon there as well, where you used to get shows like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos or even The Americans that came out before I think Netflix became a big thing, where it wasn't immediately obvious where it was going to go.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't entirely formulaic in nature. The
Mm-hmm.
script, the plot lines, the characters. There was more room for exploration and creativity and surprises. But it
Hmm.
strikes me that, and it's becoming increasingly hard, and maybe I don't know, it's an age thing, or maybe I don't have enough patience. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's become increasingly more less enjoyable to watch Netflix shows because it's pretty obvious what's going to happen,
Right.
and
Right.
I don't think it's a coincidence. I
No,
think
I
these
agree.
shows are created for according to a certain formula.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that's AI. I mean, that happened before AI came onto the scene. But I think that it's a product that they're trying to optimize. So they're
Yeah.
creating it in very specific ways according to what they think people want to see.
And
And I
I
think
do
with
think
the
the
advent of AI, that trend is just going to become more and more extreme because it's going to be easier to execute this, right? So it's going to become more extreme. So yeah, that doesn't bode very well for us as a culture.
yeah, I think the algorithmic selection definitely makes that worse.
One interesting finding in this study was that the less creative people actually benefited more at the individual level from AI than the more competent writers. Right, so less competent writers became more creative than more competent writers. So AI helped
Yeah.
more those that were less creative and less competent. The
Yeah.
second study we looked at, so they looked at the use of AI bots in a sales um, scenario, sales context. So they used
Hmm.
AI chatbots to create sales like leads, to create leads
Hmm.
to contact prospective clients, and also to create scripts to guide the conversation with those clients. Right, so two kind of
Hmm. Hmm.
sequential tasks. And so they found the use of AI increased creativity because it helped people create more intriguing, complex, engaging scripts that led to more. What was the word that they used there? Um, it intensified interactions with people.
With
But
prospective
different, to,
clients. Yeah.
yeah, but different to the first study. Here, the more competent people may found the AI more useful rather than the lower skilled individuals, because the lower skilled individuals actually got frustrated and showed negative affect when they were asked to use AI in that way. And
Yeah.
my hypothesis is that in the first instance, the task was relatively simple, more straightforward to create a certain text,
Yeah.
whereas leading a conversation with another person is a more involved task that requires higher levels of skill, perhaps. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good hypothesis. I think the same thing. It gets back to this idea of engagement, right? If the AI somehow undermines the sense of engagement, then it's going to destroy performance or reduce performance. Um, and sometimes more skilled people just have more to draw on, and so the tools might sort of foster their scripts and their ways of engaging with customers because they already have that broader base of sense or that broader sense of engaging with customers. But it
Yeah.
is interesting that the two studies seem to suggest inverted dynamics
Well, inverted in that sense, but they both indicate that there is creativity to be gained from using AI, right? So I guess,
uh,
I mean,
at the individual level,
yes.
but not at the collective level.
Well, I mean, the two levels are not unrelated, arguably.
Well,
And
but
I,
in the first study, the Doshi and Hauser, they say very explicitly it enhances creativity individually, but collectively, the creativity seems to be reduced through the use of AI.
oh, right. But yeah, I mean, but that's text based creativity at the collective level,
Right,
which
right.
stands to reason. But I think if you use it to inform a conversation, I think that dynamic might be different. So, if I'm a manager, I can definitely see the allure from there's a couple of reasons of using AI to increase creativity. I mean, that's definitely, a good reason to explore this. And also the idea that, well, other people are doing it. So I need to make sure that I don't fall behind. So I'd better look at that as well. That makes sense to me as well.
Yeah.
All right, we need to wrap up, Sean.
Yep.
Any final
Agreed.
thoughts? Final thoughts.
I think I mean, I guess the question of creativity is an open one in any given workspace. Like, how creative do you want people to be? And if the answer is a lot, then you have to think about the culture that you're creating and the leadership style that you're affecting. And I think the answer is there is transformational versus transactional, avoidance of task specific micromanagement, um, fostering a tolerance for failure, a tolerance for experimentation,
Mm-hmm.
enabling exchange between team members, and in enhancing trust amongst team members, I think are all things that would make good points of focus.
And ensure that there aren't too low or too high levels of workload, and use AI when appropriate, I guess. Two additions
Yeah,
as well.
find that sweet spot. I think the AI one's going to be an open question going forward. I don't know that we know the answer there, despite this very good research. I don't know that we yet know the answer in terms of the long-term impacts of AI on
Well, it's
human
still very
creativity.
recent, so maybe
Yeah,
that's something
right.
to get to come back to as well in a future
Yeah,
episode.
for sure.
All right, Sean, that was interesting.
Great.
Go on your merry way, and we'll talk again soon.
Excellent. Talk to you soon.
Bye.